Cienītās dāmas un kungi, ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Professor Balcerovič, Honorable President of Bank of Latvia, Mr. Rimševič, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome all of you today to the large hall of University of Latvia on the occasion of lecture of Professor Balcerovič, which will be introduced in a little bit more details by our President of National Bank. But maybe for those of you who are not always spending time at the University of Latvia, I can give you a very brief introduction to the University of Latvia. University of Latvia was founded in 1919 as the first one, and at that time the only one higher education institution in Latvia and the only one research institution. Currently we are the largest institution in our country. We have around 18,000 students, which for European scale maybe sounds like average size university, but for Latvia it's a really large university, because when I am willing to impress my guests, I'm always saying, look, it's almost 1% of current population of Latvia, and that's true. We have 13 departments, we have around 20 research institutes. We are definitely the largest research institution, because if we are counting research output, which sometimes it's not easy, but one of the ways we can count the number of publications of high-level research journals. And if we are using this criteria, which is very often used in different rankings of universities and different other assessments, then I can tell that we are producing more than 50% of all the research output which is coming from this country. So it means that we are not only the largest one, but in some sense we are the monopoly in research. But we are not only the research institution, we are not only the educational institution, we are very actively involved in all the cultural and social events which are happening in our country. And I'm sure that today's lecture of Professor Balcerovič is one of such landmarks in Latvia, which is important not only for academic people, not only people involved in finances, but for general public. This is why I'm seeing so many different people in our large aula, coming from university and coming from outside university. It means that this lecture really generates interest. But I will not be using your time, because we are mainly, of course, waiting for a lecture. But for more detailed introduction to our speakers and to the lecture, I am giving floor to the President of Bank of Latvia, Ilmārs Rimševič. Floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, it gives me the great pleasure to be here today, and also to give you a very, very small synopsis why Professor Balcerovič is today in Riga, Latvia. During the winter, probably many of you noticed that Bank of Latvia organized one of the competition regarding the financial skills in the national TV. And we promised that prize will not be the trip to ECB or some gold medal, but we will secure a highly interesting public speaker. And we didn't tell at that time that we kept in mind Professor Balcerovič. And he is here today. Let me introduce him a little bit more, even though he is a man who does not need any introduction, but I thought that this would be appropriate if I would give you just a little bit, some more information about his biography. In 1974, many of us even were not born at that time, he already gained MBA at St. John's University in New York. In 1975, he received his PhD. Since 1992, Lešeka Balcerovič has been the professor of Warsaw State University, and as a head of Department of International Comparative Studies. He has been also a corresponding member of the History and Philosophy class of the Polish Academy of Arts and Sciences since 2006. Speaking about political involvement, Mr. Balcerovič is considered as an architect of Poland's economic reforms installed or initiated in 1989. He also designed and executed the radical stabilization and transformation of the Polish economy since the fall of communism in Poland. In September 1989, Leszek Balcerovič was appointed as a Deputy Prime Minister of Poland and Minister of Finance in the first non-communist government in Poland after the Second World War. He retained his position in the government until December of 1991. From April 1995 to December 2000, he was the president of the Freedom Union, a free market-oriented party, and from 1997 until June 2000, he was the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. And from 2001 up until 2007, Mr. Balcerovič was the Governor of Central Bank of Poland. I think it's also important, besides those very maybe dry facts, also to tell that he is very active in other areas as well. He's also the member of the Washington-based International Advisory Board, so-called Group of 30, a member of the Group of Trustees of Institute of International Finance, and a member of Advisory Scientific Committee, providing advice and assistance on issues relevant to the work of European Systemic Risk Board. Leszek Balcerovič is also the chairman and the founder of Civil Development Forum Foundation, based in Warsaw. He holds honorary doctorates from more than 20 universities around the world. Also awarded Poland's highest decoration order of the White Eagle, for the contribution to the system transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Leszek Balcerovič.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I am very proud to be in the role of a prize in this competition. I am not going to take 1 hour and a half because I would like to leave as much time as possible for the discussion. We cannot discuss all the problems, neither all the proposed solutions, but at least to look at some of the main points. First of all, in economics, like in medicine, you have to first make diagnosis, and then based on that to propose to proceed to the therapy. There is often talk of the crisis in the Eurozone as though all the countries in the Eurozone were struck by a crisis, and this is not true. We have a very sharp differentiation of economic situation inside of the Eurozone. As a matter of fact, you have some new divisions. There is a Nordic group and the Southern group. And the Nordic group, as you know, includes Germany, Austria, Finland, Netherlands, and some other countries. And I think it is worth remembering that Germany 10 years ago was a sick man of Europe. Germany 10 years ago was like Italy now. But then there were reforms. And Chancellor Schroeder, and after time, Germany has recovered, improved the situation. I think this is a very important lesson. Finland was in crisis, a very deep one, in the early 90s, and the recession lasted for, as far as I remember, more than 2 years. But Finland has enacted a very important and deep reforms, which are the source of today's strengths. But speaking about the second group, which includes Greece, and which I think is a special problem, but also Portugal, Italy, and Spain. And focusing for a while on this group, I think one can distinguish 3 kinds of problems. By the way, these problems are also present outside the Eurozone, but I am coming to that. Now, first, there are 2 types of crisis, depending on the dynamic, on the sequence. The first one may be called financial or banking crisis, which leads to the fiscal crisis. And the second type has a reverse sequence. It starts with the fiscal crisis, which spills over to the financial crisis. And let me discuss this very briefly. Now, you can see the figures, which are illustration, but these figures refer to Ireland and Spain. Both of these countries have developed a huge housing boom until 2007, which then collapsed. You have bust only because you have booms before. There is no bust without the previous boom. So one has to watch what is happening with the rate of credit. Isn't it going too fast? Now, it's obvious that the approximate reason for the housing, for the bust was the previous boom. And if you look at the rate of growth of housing credit in Spain or in Ireland, it was very, very fast. And then what has happened after a while, economy goes into deep recession. One should remember that in Spain in 2007, they have almost a balanced budget, and then 2 years later, there was a huge deficit. So you have from the financial sector problem to the fiscal problem. This is the spillover, and it is very visible. The key question is, what are the root causes of the private sector booms which happened from time to time? And the conventional wisdom is that the root causes are just pure market failures, market failures, etc. I'm not denying that there are some errors made from time to time by the private bankers. For example, I think Swedish banks were not very prudent in extending loans, housing loans in Latvia, and this has produced this housing bubble. But I think it is a simplification to blame the markets, because the deeper analysis of the root causes discloses lots of wrong policies which induce private actors to act in an excessively risky way. I may add that I had the pleasure of being the member of the so-called De La Rosière group at the European Union level, and we spent quite a lot of time at looking what are the root causes, what are the recommendations, and we have found lots of wrong policies at the bottom of the financial crisis which leads to fiscal crisis. And this is just a list of some of these wrong policies. If central banks keep excessively low interest rates for an excessively long time, this may fuel the credit boom, as it was the case in the US, to some extent also in the Eurozone. There are tax preferences for incurring housing debt, which are still in place in many countries. There are some regulations which encourage banks to lend to the governments. So not all regulations are correct. And one should be hesitant in supporting just more regulations as a solution. One has to look at which regulations have contributed to the recent crisis. And another example would be too big to fail. You might have heard this expression referring to huge financial conglomerates which are found too big to fail, so central bankers and governments feel compelled to bail them out. But what are the root causes for the emergence of these too big to fail conglomerates? Are they the product of pure markets? No, they are products of distorted markets, and the markets were distorted by previous policies, which started to bail out large institutions some 40 or 50 years ago, and distorted expectations of the creditors, because creditors came to the conclusion that it is less risky to lend to large banks because large banks are going to be bailed out. So risk premiums have been lowered regarding large banks, and this helped them to be even larger. And then finally, you have huge financial monsters, so to say, the size of which was well beyond or above what is justified by estimates of economies of scale or economies of scope. So if you want to, one lesson is, and this goes beyond problems in the Eurozone, is that if you want to reduce the probability of future financial crisis, we have to look at some official policies and not only burden the markets with extra regulations. And the job is not finished, in my mind. We may come to this later. Now, the second type of crisis starts with a systematic overspending. And clearly, this is not a market phenomenon. This is a political phenomenon. If governments systematically overspend, meaning they increase spending at the cost of growing public debt. In the most extreme form, it has been happening in Greece, at least until 2010, but Greece is only the most extreme example of much larger family of countries. In the Eurozone, we have also Portugal. Outside Eurozone, Britain has a fiscal boom. Now, what is happening? During the boom years, everybody is happy. There is an overspending. Jobs in the public administration usually are added. But public debt is growing relative to GDP. And finally, sooner or later, the day of reckoning is coming. And then everything goes into the reverse. The fiscal boom spills over to the financial sector, on the banking sector, for the simple reason that among the creditors of the governments, among those institutions which lend to the governments are financial institutions, including the banks. So this is why the Greek banks, in practice, are insolvent, because they lended to the Greek government. Part of the reason for the Cyprus problem is that the Cyprus banks have lended to the Greek government. And this is not only the banks which lend to the governments, which became in fiscal difficulties. There are pension funds, there are insurance companies who lend to the governments which overspend. Now, there are still some pathological regulations in place which encourage banks to lend to the sovereigns, like credit weights, Basel regulations, and they should be removed. Now, what are the root causes? So you can see that systematic overspending, which leads to the accumulation of public debt, sooner or later go bust, and then you have both fiscal and financial crisis, like in Greece or to some extent in Portugal. The question is, what are the root causes of this fiscal boom, the systematic overspending, which is usually noticed, social spending and public administration? Well, you have to look to the political system and to society at large. And I think in those countries or instances when you have a systematic overspending, the nature of political competition is destructive or not constructive, so politicians compete by pretending they are Santa Clauses. You know, they promise more. And unfortunately, some of them keep these promises. So they spend more by accumulating debt. So one has to change the nature of the political competition, which is the job of civil society. So one needs civil society groups which would try to keep in check the governments and to improve the terms on which politicians compete. And this is a very important job. And second, whenever you have this overspending, there were very weak constraints, fiscal constraints on the governments, on the states, if any. So they could borrow and borrow and borrow and accumulate public debt. So the second point is, countries, both in the Eurozone and outside the Eurozone, need fiscal constraints so that they cannot go on accumulating. And in this connection, I may mention that the best part of Poland's constitution, I think, by far, is one article. We have a constitution introduced in 1997, and one article says that the public debt cannot exceed 60% of GDP, so we have inserted already in 1997, Maastricht debt criteria, and this has saved us from much worse fiscal outcomes. So you have these two types of a crisis, financial fiscal and fiscal financial, but also there's a third problem, a stagnation. Like in Italy for the last more than 10 years, so the rate of growth is slowing down. And the root cause is while the public debt remains high or even it's growing. The root causes of a tendency for stagnation is usually the accumulation of distortions. As a result of bad politics. You have less and less competition, you have more and more regulations, you have growing influence of politicians in the enterprises, and as a result of all this, economy slows down, which is the problem in itself. And on top of that, there may be a growing fiscal burden. Well, the solution, I think, is obvious. You have to do something about the reasons. You have to reverse the reasons for stagnation, which usually is called structural reforms. Amount of structural reforms depends on the size of the problem. And they differ. To some extent, let me be quite frank, I think France is following in the footsteps of Italy. If you look at France, if you exclude the impact of demography, which is relatively favorable in France, you would have similar profile, the tendency for slower and slower growth. So there are three problems. Whenever there are problems in the Eurozone, I think that of these three types. They may be combined, but let me mention that similar problems, some similar problems have occurred outside the Eurozone. And I am here comparing three countries which are struck by problems: Japan, United Kingdom, and United States. You see, Japan, of course, started to develop problem earlier. There was an extreme boom in the 80s, and United States and Britain have developed their problems later, but the profile is similar. And their experience could be contrasted with, say, Canada or Sweden, which have avoided such grave problems. Here, different developments regarding the budget deficits. On the left side, you have these three problem countries. On the right side, you have Canada and Sweden, which shows there are differences, not only in the Eurozone, but also outside Eurozone, which suggest one basic lesson: domestic policies matter. Meaning differences in the domestic policies are crucial, even in the European Union, including the Eurozone. But besides differences in domestic policies, you have differences in domestic politics. So you have to work, whenever there are consistent and bad policies, you have to do something about domestic politics. And good domestic policy cannot be imposed. I don't think. You have to work at home by improving it. I think this is one of the main lessons. I am not denying that there might be some useful initiatives at the European Unions, but they are not sufficient. They cannot overrule some bad tendencies in the respective countries. Now, you see a difference as far as gross public debt is concerned. In Canada and Sweden, it has been much lower than in Japan, United Kingdom, and the United States. So, there are some problems in the Eurozone, but there are also some problems in some countries outside the Eurozone. And the question to which I am going to pass in a minute is there any link between the essence of the Eurozone and the fact that some countries have developed problems, or is it just completely accidental? And I would say at this moment that there is a link, that certain specificities of the Eurozone construction might have contributed that some countries developed problems, But I think this is not a fatal link. So with proper domestic policies, you can neutralize this special effect. But I am coming to that. Now let me just present what sort of measures or events usually happen once the bubble bursts, once there's a fiscal crisis or fiscal and financial crisis. This is just the list. Well, some countries get bailouts, which means conditional credit from official sources. The specialized institution, it's called International Monetary Fund, but European Union has developed its own, so to say, fund, which is the European Stabilization Mechanism. And on the item second, you have central banks as a source of bailout funds. And let me mention that, from my point of view, this is the most controversial proposition. That's a huge differences in views. I must confess, I belong to the skeptics as regarding the growing involvement of the central banks as source of bailouts. But I may come to that. Well, I think some people hope or think that the excessive debt burden may be reduced via inflation. This has happened after the Second World War in the 50s in the United States. I'm not a proponent of this solution, and I would add that this time, to reduce inflation, the reduce public debt and other private debt via inflation would be more difficult, because you need a repressed financial sector. You would have to control market interest rates, which would require that all the countries go back to the system, financial system, which existed some 30 years ago. I think this would mean, in fact, the destruction of the single market in financial services. So those who dream that inflation would solve the problem of the public debt should consider the consequences. Then the fourth event which happens after some crisis is an outright debt reduction. So open debt reduction, which can be either negotiated or unilateral. And so to say, it belongs from time to time to a market solution. I remember Poland has inherited a huge public debt, after the 70s. And then when I was in charge of Poland's economy after '89, I came to the conclusion that, of course, we have to launch massive and radical reforms. And based on that, we should seek debt reduction, and we have obtained debt reduction. So it happens. Now, the problem is if a large country with a huge public debt would seek the debt reduction, it would be a huge shock. Small countries cannot produce huge negative shocks. Large countries can. So this is not a universal solution. And finally, the number 5 are reforms and including fiscal consolidation. And if they are successful, and they're coming to that, what is the experience of successful and non-successful, this is the only right solution. Because this is the only step which can cure the inherited disease. So I am ending with some comments regarding this list. So let me repeat. Bailouts may smooth the problems, but they do not solve the problems. And they can't. When IMF is lending money, it's lending money based on conditionality. And it is the conditionality which is implemented, if it is proper, which solves the problems, but not IMF money. And the same goes for every kind of a bailout, including the money from central banks. Central banks, whenever they offered conditional money, they go beyond their classical functions, and which I think endangers the constitutionality of such a measure and leads to some risky consequences. And even if it helps to smooth the problem, let me repeat that it cannot solve the problem. So there is no magic involved. Repressed financial sector is hopefully not in sight as a solution via inflation. So practical, these are proper packages of reforms, including fiscal reforms and, if necessary, supply-side reforms, which offer the lasting solutions to the problems. And here I would like to mention 2 points, which go a bit contrary to conventional wisdom. The popular discussion about fiscal consolidation is dominated by a word, austerity. And in a popular usage, the word austerity is becoming a bad word, something negative. You harm the people by implementing austerity. And I think this is improper, because it overlooks, this popular use of the word austerity overlooks 2 questions. First, some countries do not have a better choice than to reduce public deficits. Where would they borrow and at what interest rates if they are in the fiscal crisis? Could they rely on the constant support from other countries? This certainly generates political tension. This is the first point. So even if what is called austerity tends to reduce short-term economic growth, other options may be worse. Or other options may be non-available because markets would charge a very high interest rates, and official creditors would be would be unwilling to lend. But the second point is even more important. I am struck that in the official publication of IMF, to some extent European Commission, a very important distinction is overlooked. And this is distinction based on what is the basis of reducing the budget deficit. Is it reducing expenditures, especially current expenditures, or is it increasing taxes? Why does it matter? It matters because there is a massive body of empirical research which would suggest that expenditure-based consolidation, those which are reducing current expenditures, are much more successful than consolidation which tend to increase taxes. And somehow it is this distinction which is, I think, fundamental. It is overlooked in the official discussions about fiscal consolidation in Europe. And if you introduce a program which reduces deficit at the cost of increasing taxes, most likely it is not going to be lastingly successful. So and I am just quoting lots of examples of empirical research which suggest that reducing spending, especially current spending, it's much more successful on average than increasing taxes. What is more, we have another body of empirical research which suggests that under some conditions, not all conditions, but some conditions, a very tough stabilization program based on the reducing current expenditures may, contrary to conventional wisdom, stimulate short-term growth, not only long-term growth, which is in the literature called non-Keynesian effects, via increasing confidence. This is a confidence effect, and via reducing wages, and in this way strengthening competitiveness. And this body of research should be also considered without assuming that under every condition you can get these favorable effects. What are the conditions which are more likely to produce such effects? If there's a crisis of confidence in the fiscal stance, if people are afraid that taxes would tend to increase, and if under such conditions you have a very tough fiscal program, the tough one which dispels the worries. If confidence is lost, it cannot be regained by words. You need very tough actions. And if government surprises people by tough actions, there's a chance that you may get more confidence, and spending, especially investment spending, is based on confidence. It's not based on mechanical injection of public money. people are not Pavlov dogs that just mechanically react to what politicians say and do. There's a confidence effect. So, there's a list of publications which testify that under some conditions, austerity may be expansionary, not necessarily recessionary. Now, if I would like to sum up before going into this issue, then I would say that one should look, first of all, at the domestic level, at what sort of policies are being pursued. That countries which have a fiscal crisis do not have a better choice than continuing what is called austerity, but fiscal consolidation would be mostly expenditure-based, and supplemented, if necessary, by a program of supply-side reforms. And this depends from country to country. So comprehensive approach, and a radical in a sense that the change should not be delayed, offers the best solution. And finally, my last remark would be that one should not regard monetary policy, especially non-conventional policy, consisting in very low interest rates kept for a long time, plus quantitative easing, as a magical formula. There may be, in the longer run, a medicine which is worse than the disease. But I am speaking as old-fashioned former central bankers. We should consider that. And this is the last point, which is there any link between some core features of the Eurozone and the fact that problems emerged, not in all Eurozone countries, but in some Eurozone countries? You have quite a debate on this point, which is fundamental. Oh, I skipped this. Now, there are two kinds of problems now which emerge in the Eurozone. The first one is not related to the essence, meaning that, for example, that the fact that large banks operating in the Eurozone happen to have low capital to asset ratios, in my mind, is not strongly linked to the Eurozone. It's just happening accidentally. So let us focus on the second point. And I think one can sum up statements about structural problems in the Eurozone into two. The first one is pretty well known. People say, and this was known from the very beginning, that obviously if you have one central bank for a number of countries, the monetary policy of the central bank cannot fit all in a perfect way. The question is it fatal or not? Well, my position is not fatal, in a sense that you can neutralize. You can get some benefits from the euro, and you can also, at least with the proper domestic policies, neutralize the deficiency. The second point, it says, many people at the inception of the Eurozone were saying, monetary union can lastingly exist with a political union. But to my knowledge, they have not defined what they meant by political union. So I would like to, at the end, to discuss these two problems. First, now this monetary policy cannot fit all, can have two dimensions or two aspects. The first I called temporal, meaning that if one country is in the recession phase and another one is in the boom phase, then they both require different interest rates, official interest rates. And this was the issue which was mostly discussed. It was recognized, and I don't think this turned out to be a very serious problem, because until recently at least, business cycles in the Eurozone were more or less synchronized. So there were no large divergences between the business cycle situation in the Eurozone. I think what was overlooked was the second aspect, or largely overlooked, which I called structural, meaning that for some countries, for most of the time, European Central Bank interest rate would tend to be too low. And if they are too low, what do they generate? Credit booms. And I think it is not an accident. It was not an accident that the most intensive credit boom has happened where? In the Eurozone, in Spain and in Ireland. Because ECB's interest rates were especially too low for these countries. I don't want to go into the theory of natural interest rates, but it's something to do. I think this is the most serious problem, and the question is, can it be neutralized to some extent? In economic terms, yes. And what are the solutions? First, you have to have much tighter fiscal policy to neutralize excessively low interest rates, so you have to have a very disciplined budgetary rules. And second, and this is, I think, something probably new as a conclusion from the recent crisis, some special tools are needed, and they are called macroprudential regulations. So if you see that housing credit is growing too fast and you cannot increase interest rates, you need to use other instruments, like lowering loan-to-value ratio. From my own experience in Poland as a central banker, I can tell you that in 2006, we have seen that credit denominated in hard currency was growing too fast. And our interest rates were already high. What we did, we introduced some extra regulations. So countries for whom ECB interest rates could be too low should develop these special tools and should have extra tough fiscal policies. Now, another problems which have been raised in connection with one monetary policy cannot fit all is the statement that if you are in the Eurozone or if you have a euro-based currency board like the Baltics, you cannot devalue. You cannot make an external devaluation. You can only rely on internal devaluation. And some people are saying this is very difficult or impossible, which is an empirical statement. And I'm now showing you a comparison which I very much like, especially if I am in the Baltics, which shows that in some countries at least it is possible. The peaks are very well known. Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. BEL are less known, which is Bulgaria and the Baltics. And what is striking, look, these BEL countries have developed a huge boom, which have collapsed, and you see the collapse of GDP. But then you see a very strong recovery on the left side. Yes? So GDP has recovered, while Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Bulgaria, they have kept euro-based currency boards. So they were in the same situation as Greece or Italy, without external devaluation. Very different dynamics. Why? Well, this shows that financial markets have positively reacted to tough adjustment program. In the BEL countries, look, the yields on government bonds have jumped, but then have declined without massive bailouts, just in reaction to tough policies. It's a different story, quite a different story in the PIGS countries. So Ireland has been doing a similar adjustment program to the one in the Baltics, and has a similar consequences. I will skip this. There was a huge adjustment in a current account. Look on this left side, in the BEL countries. They have developed huge imbalances because of massive inflows of capital, but then within 2 or 3 years, they switched to balance or even the surplus, which is amazing adjustment. A very different story regarding the PIGS countries, very much slower, but also differentiated. Ireland is doing better, Portugal is doing better than Greece. And I think this is, to some extent, an explanation. Both group of countries, because of the boom, have lost competitiveness. So they needed to regain competitiveness, but they could not achieve that with external devaluation. They have to reduce salaries and wages, which is the essence of internal devaluation, and they did it. Bulgaria is a bit of an outlier. But look at Ireland. Ireland is doing as good as the Baltics. So this is just an empirical demonstration that under some political conditions, internal devaluation is possible. And this is the only solution if you want to remain in the Eurozone. Once you allowed credit boom to develop and competitiveness to be eroded. So one has to look at the experience of the Baltic countries among other countries. And finally, let me finish with one remark about monetary union. Does the preservation of monetary union require a political union, and what does it mean? Now, the first question, what does it mean? And I don't think it was defined at the inception of the Eurozone when it was proposed that sooner or later political union should be developed. Some people thought that political union is like a federal state. So unless Eurozone becomes a federal state, there is no chance for the preservation of the Eurozone. My response to that, Eurozone is not going to become a federal state, and it is not necessary for the preservation of the Eurozone. A federal state in a contemporary interpretation has to include a large common budget. And a common budget in the Eurozone is about 1%. And there is not much expectation for it to get larger. And I don't think that it is necessary to save the Eurozone because there was not a lack of large common budget which has contributed to the problems in the Eurozone whenever the problems have appeared. There was a lack of discipline. So I think just to sum up a big topic and to open the discussion, what the Eurozone needs for a better functioning is first focus on domestic politics and policies so as to solve the problems wherever they occurred in some countries. To wit, I don't see there is a European solution for Italian problems, but there are Italian solutions for Italian problems, which have been well identified. And at the European level, what is, I think, needed, certainly encouragement for more discipline in the respective countries. And I think fiscal pact, six-packs are going in the right direction, but they cannot substitute, let me repeat, for much better politics and much better policies in the respective states. Thank you very much. Sorry for speaking longer than I promised.
Thank you very much, Mr. Balcerovič, for this lecture. Before we start discussion, just for your information, lecture as such will be available at the website of the Latvian University webpage, and this is also recorded. The same record will be available there. So, who would like to start? And when you get the microphone, please state your name and institution.
Michael, Latvian television. I would like to ask you about the Cypriotic crisis which is happening right now. How do you evaluate the measures of the government of taking this 10%, around 10% from the deposits which are kept in local banks? Do you think this is a normal measure for these days? And what would be your recommendation how to get Cypriotic people out of the crisis?
Well, your question reminds me that discussing euro is like discussing the situation on the front. There are always current developments which raise attention. Well, in order to assess any option, you have to compare it. So what would be the alternative option? Burdening taxpayers in other countries permanently? I think it is a risky option because there is a growing resistance, and rightly so, in countries which would be the Netherlands. Second, there have been some special factors in Cyprus attracting lots of money from outside. So I would be generally the proponent of this measure. It is a pity that the original proposals, as put forward by, I understand, IMF, were not admitted, because the original proposal was to reduce more large deposit and less small deposits.
Please, next question. Yeah. Ladies first.
Ramona Rupei-Kāpoga from University of Latvia. First of all, I would like to thank you for coming in Riga and sharing today with us your challenging ideas about the European Union. And I would like to know your personal opinion about the introduction, about the necessity of introduction of the euro in Poland. And also, what is your thought? How long will exist the European zone? Maybe some
The second question is what?
How long will exist European Union? Your personal opinion, it will be for 10, 20 years, for a very long period, or yes, it's forever, or for some just next years?
Well, you want me to be a prophet, and to even more, the prophet of doom, which is always attractive to be. On the pessimistic side, it's more attractive to be optimist, etc. Okay, I don't see any danger to a dissolution of the European Union. It is exaggerated. One cannot exclude, of course, that if some countries which are burdened with the problems in the Eurozone would not respond properly with the policy, that sooner or later they would opt for leaving. But I am not making the professor, I am just mentioning that one cannot exclude this probability. Against this, it is an argument that even in Greece and even more and also in other problem countries, a strong majority of people is in favor of remaining in the Eurozone. Of course, this has to be translated in the stronger support of the policies which are necessary to remain in a productive way. But having said that, I think one has to look at the policies in the European Union and see which policies are conducive to economic growth in the countries. Economic growth is a key, even for rich countries, and even more for poorer countries like ours, the Baltics, and which are conducive and which are not. And then try to strengthen or complete the good policies and do something about doubtful policies. A very brief comment. And the first group, obviously, is completing the single market, which means services. And there was a service directive proposed some years ago, which addressed the services which could be exported by poorer countries. And this was watered down in the European Parliament by richer countries. So richer countries should reconsider that. I remember that because Polish plumber was presented as a demon, like Genghis Khan in France. It's a completely nonsensical. So the first one. Second, if possible, multilateral trade negotiations. European Union should try to do more to advance that, which means one has to look at common agricultural policies. Third, and this to some extent may be an alternative to the second, transatlantic trade, I think it would be very useful. But again, we have to look at CAP. Otherwise, fourth, I think competition policy at the European level makes more sense than at the national level, I think it should get. Fifth, macroeconomic monitoring should be strengthened, but it requires a lot of competence because people can make mistakes. And I think my observation is one needs sometimes better people. And this is macroeconomic monitoring by the European Commission. It's not an alternative to monitoring by the citizens of their own government. But this is on the plus side. On the minus side to be discussed, I think it was unnecessary drift of social policies to the European Union level. And some of these policies are harmful. Or employment. You don't have firm foundation in the treaties regarding this export of these policies. And I think some of the tensions between Britain and European Commission are due to the fact that there were some employment directives which were imposed on Britain. Certainly more regulation is not a solution for problems who have growth problems. And finally, and this is heretical, climate policy in the European Union does not have strong analytical basis. This is out of the thin air, 3 times 20. I can refer to Polish Academy of Sciences, which is a special committee on that, and they are not crazy people. They are not biased, and they question the rationality of these policies. By the way, even if you are strongly convinced that without radically reducing the emission of CO2, the globe will be in danger, what European Union can do when China and the United States are continuing to do it? It is completely unnecessary sacrifice, and the cost of the sacrifice falls on poorer countries. We in Poland pay more than richer countries. I think it should be reconsidered, and ideologically based policy should not be pursued. So this is a bit broader answer. How to improve, how to make European Union framework better, still better for economic growth. On euro, Poland's situation is very different from the Baltic situation, including Latvia. Because Baltic countries have rightly, I think, have made right decision to go for currency boards. Euro-based currency boards. You are small countries. On the bigger countries like Poland can have independent monetary policy, and I think this arrangement have served you well. I think it was very important that you have stuck to the Euro-based currency board. With great courage, you made very radical reforms to preserve this. But since you have this, it's only a small step to enter Eurozone. So it's not a great change. It's a small step, and I think it's a logical completion of what you have introduced before, this Euro-based currency board, and you have a model, Estonia. So Estonia has done this step. I understand Lithuania is also considering. In Poland, we are in a very different situation because we have a different monetary regime. We have a floating rate of exchange. We have inflation targeting. So for us, it would be a revolution. You have already made a revolution. And so it's a much bigger step. And for larger countries, having independent monetary policy is more justified than for smaller countries. So now in Poland, it's not immediate entry into the Eurozone is not on the books. And there's a lot of debate on that. And we are not meeting the fiscal criteria. Our budget deficit is 4% of GDP at least. In your case, it's less than 2%. So Latvia has to be congratulated on that.
Some more? Yeah?
Vilnis Zakarevskis, freelance economist and entrepreneur. Thank you, first of all, for a very comprehensive lecture. But I have a question. You've been talking about structural aspect of how to, let's say, minimize the impact of monetary policy or absence of monetary policy of Euroland countries. And my question is, I understand, of course, there are some options for eliminating or limiting boom and bust when you need a higher interest rate. But what do you do with opposite side of coin?
Without what?
With opposite side of coin. When you need money, when you need lower interest rate to stimulate economy, to stimulate investment into human capital, into physical capital, which is the prerequisite for the economic growth, if you agree. So if we turn this a little bit different, where the growth of the Spain, Portugal, Latvia, etc. will come from when we'll give away our monetary policy?
Now, the biggest danger, which was largely overlooked, was excessively low interest rates, because, which generate boom. You suffered the boom here and in the Baltics because you have excessively low interest rate. There were huge inflows of foreign capital, and for some reasons, I understand, it was not possible, sufficient to neutralize these inflows. So worry about that. And you cannot generate welfare, economic growth with persistently too low interest rates. If this was the case, everybody would be rich. Growth does not come from keeping interest rates too low. You generate growth if you have sufficient employment and increases in employment and productivity, which comes from competition, from good education, etc. So I wouldn't worry about. Well, once again, the problem of the Baltics is not that upon the entry, final entry in the Eurozone, interest rates for you would be too high. No, they may be too low. And then you have to prepare for this contingency.
Martins Bitans from Bank of Latvia. I'd like to come back to the role of monetary policy in all this, because one of the things that the current euro crisis has shown that the central bank has to be the lender of last resort in order to avoid market panic. And we see that only when the ECB stepped in and acted as this lender of last resort that the markets calmed down. Of course, there's the other side of this. Then, if you keep this policy of non-traditional operations for too long, then you are risking that you start to encourage risky behavior, as the banks assume that they will be bailed out when they run into the problems. So, is there possible, and what do you think, is there possible to draw a line, and what would you suggest? What should we look at if we want to decide when these central bank non-standard policies are warranted and they are implemented in order to avoid the market panic, and when these policies are already starting sowing the seeds of the next bubble and start encouraging risky behavior of the banks? And just as a matter of practical question, maybe, what do you think, is the current Fed policies already overstepping the line when they're just calming down the markets and maybe already start risking risky behavior, or maybe the ECB is already stepping over the line when they start encouraging maybe next crisis in the future? So what do you think?
Well, this is probably the most hotly discussed issue in economic policy and in macroeconomics, and there are sharply divided sides. I already make a confession that I belong to the skeptics of this non-conventional policy. Let me mention why. But first, just in case, what is this non-conventional policy? It has two elements. First, keeping interest rates very low, not for 1 year, not for 2 years, for 5 years and more. So the problem was not that interest rates were sharply lowered after the bubble burst. The problem has been, in my mind, that these very low interest rates have been kept for the 5th year. By whom? Well, there is a Japanese experience, the longest ones. Then you have very aggressive behavior of Fed in the United States, and even more aggressive in Britain, Bank of England. And now, as you know, there is much pressure on the ECB to follow in their footsteps. The second component of what is called non-conventional policy is creating money. As you know, central banks are only institutions which create the fiat money in order to buy securities massively, including government securities. So these are two components. Now, the arguments for the proponents of this policy are that without that, economic growth would have been even worse affected. But whenever you ask them, you ask the central bankers in United States. They refer you to their models. You know, our model tells us that without this intervention, economic growth would be lower in the US. So thanks to our intervention, it is higher and everybody is benefiting, including countries which are complaining, like Brazil, that they complain that the Brazil real is becoming too strong. The problem with this response is that the models are wrong. And you know, models as a set of equations are wrong. And they do not consider, there is no room for negative effects of these policies. So just you can see the dangers in the model. One danger is that if you persist with very low interest rates, this will slow down restructuring of the economy because it would be so cheap and easy to restructure the debt incurred by large corporations. And this has happened in Japan. And it's pretty widely recognized as one of the reasons for Japanese sluggishness in growth. There is no room for that, to my knowledge, in the models. So the model response is what they want to. That's the first. The second, as you pointed out in your question, is that what about the exit? Especially from a very low interest rates and for massive purchases of bonds. Exit is not, you would have to sell what you have bought. You have to suck in the massive amount of money which has been injected in the economy. And it is not completely easy problem, technically speaking. And the more you prolong, the more difficult it may be to exit these policies. Third, even now, I think to some extent, you have already some bubbles. Not necessarily in the US, but in countries, the currency of which is linked to the dollar, like China. Some emerging economies are complaining of this policy. Fourth, there is a danger of something which is being called in a pointed way, currency wars. No, massive printing of dollar may contribute to a weaker dollar, but what about the euro? What about the yen? If other countries start doing the same, there would be like competitive devaluations. In the end, everybody loses. And finally, if all major central banks are engaging in massive printing of money, then you would have a global, huge increase in the supply globally in money. And what about the final reaction, which could be inflation? So there are, I would say that the benefits of these policies were likely to occur in the short term, but the costs and risks are growing with time. And these are 5 points why such a policy would be even more dangerous in the European Union. Because number one problem in the European Union is trust, decline in the confidence. There is a lesson that treaties were concluded, but they were broken, Stability and Growth Pact. And these sort of policies, I don't think, in fact, they would break the treaties, the mandate of ECB.
Morten Hansen.
Yeah, hello, Morten Hansen, Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. And even though you have touched upon this already, I would like to bring you back to Cyprus, if you don't mind, because you answered many other questions I would like to raise. And you also mentioned the word trust just a little bit before, and I was very surprised myself when I saw this idea of that you would also make a little haircut on those who have small deposits, meaning less than 100,000 euros, because to me that suddenly means that deposit guarantee is no longer deposit guarantee. And the trust that I otherwise had in sort of the policymakers from the European Union, it sort of got a dent there. I mean, to me, this here wasn't really thought out, and to me that could basically create a bank run in other countries. So I wonder what your comment is on that they made this suggestion, which otherwise might be off the table already now, but coming up with that suggestion, I mean, they should have seen that this here could create a bank run, shouldn't they? Thanks.
Well, this is just the statement. I have nothing to add to what I have said. You have to compare options. The other options which would be equally risky and would probably lead to in the blind alley. Taxpayer revolt by financing the deposit of a richer people. How could you convince the Germans or the Dutch? Because you would have to defend in front of the parliaments. First. Second, Deposit insurance had been introduced only in the 30s in the United States, by the way, against Roosevelt. He was against it because there was a previous experience that states in the United States which have introduced deposit insurance encourage banks to be less prudent, because banks, if you are insured and you are a depositor, you don't have any incentive to monitor the bank. And in 19th century, when there was no deposit insurance, capital in the banks relative to asset was much higher. But then it went down. So perhaps we should go in the direction of less insurance, regarding especially big depositors.
Some more? If another question, but not the same. Yeah.
James Samuel, Chartered Accountant from the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, and currently a student of the University of Latvia.
Sorry, I can't hear you. So,
yeah. James Samuel.
Yes.
Chartered Accountant from the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, and currently a student in the University of Latvia, Department of Finance. I have basically 3 questions relating all to the euro. Number 1, with Germany acting as the godfather for most of the European countries and France backing it up, do you think Germany can hold out, guaranteeing all these various countries that are basically in the doldrums, right from Portugal, Greece, right now Cyprus? Secondly,
so the question is whether Germany will continue to finance the bailouts?
Secondly, with the euro being jeopardized with the various interest rates that are falling up and down, will there be a shift in the policy of the exports in comparison with the Asian giants? Germany, as you're aware, has fallen in the automobile industry. But considering the fact that the euro is still holding out, will it continue to be a major force in comparison with China, India per se?
Sorry, you're asking whether Germany will continue to be strong?
Yes, the
in
economy,
exports?
that's right. And thirdly, of course, your opinion with regard to the adoption of the euro in Latvia. Estonia didn't do very well, in my opinion. What do you think? What's your opinion on this aspect?
Well, regarding the third question, I thought I tried to respond, but I may repeat, just in case. The Baltics have adopted euro-based currency boards in the past. It was a correct decision, judged by the alternatives. It helped to stabilize the economies. It was popular, and rightly so, and probably it helped to introduce tough, necessary reforms, because I guess many people understood that these reforms are necessary in order to maintain euro-based currency board, which has been popular. So 3 dimensions. Now, having this arrangement, there's only a small step to enter the Eurozone. That's not a revolution. The revolution was already done. So certainly, I don't see any major risk by making this logical step. And by the way, as I said, you have your neighbor to the north, which went through it, and it's useful to ask them the questions. How was it, and what are the consequences? On the first, the question was regarding, okay, whether, if the question was whether Germans would agree to increase the size of their subsidies to the bailouts indefinitely, the response is obviously not. There are limits to what people from some countries would be willing to pay for other countries, and this is not only the Germans, it is the Dutch, the Finns, the Slovaks, etc., and they are right, I would say, basically, because one should not separate decisions from responsibility. If there are decisions taken at the national level which are leading to bad outcomes, well, the consequences have to be suffered and conclusions have to be drawn. I think there has been a false use of the word solidarity. Solidarity should not be the opposite to responsibility, and sometimes it is used as something opposite to responsibility. And also there is an economic argument. If you make decisions which are bad and other people are paying for your decisions, you are encouraged to continue bad decisions. This is just called moral hazard. So it is in the longer interest of everybody to encourage responsibility at the individual level and at the country level. And so I am not surprised that there are questions asked about continuation of this. And the second question was whether Germany will continue to be a strong exporter and a strong economy. This was the second question. I just want to make sure. Well, the country's performance depends on policies. And Germany has shown that it went to the weak period and then it reformed. And I guess that most of the Germans understand the benefits of the reform they did. So there's a probability that they will continue, even though one cannot predict politics. And the German strengths in exports have been present for a long time, given the special structure of the German economy. They specialize, as you know, in investment goods, which are largely imported by fast-growing emerging economy. And the share of export from Germany to outside Europe is growing. So Germany is becoming less dependent on export to Europe, the Eurozone.
Hello, Miguel Antunes from Portugal.
Portugal?
Yeah. I want to ask if Portugal is too big to fail. Could ever Portugal fail? Any good future for Portugal, for what you see in this moment? And in your opinion, the Portugal efforts will make up, will compensate, or could be wasted time?
Well, I don't want to pretend I am an expert on every topic, including Portugal. That's very dangerous. So what I can say is based on what I can read on reforms in various countries and also the data. If you look at the data, you see that Portugal is economic growth. It's a recession, but not as deep as in Greece. Data and development of yields, it is here. Yes, Portugal is doing well. When interest rates are declining, it is a sign of growing confidence by the markets. Yes, so look, in the case of, what's that? Yields. In the case of Greece, they are not very good, but in the case of Portugal, it appears that markets are gradually regaining confidence to the prospect of the Portugal economy. And generally speaking, if you have a fiscal problem and you don't have a rich uncle who would indefinitely finance you, you have to do something. And the best would be to reduce spending, which is not very popular, but better than to increase taxes if taxes are already high, and they are high. In every Western economy, there are high taxes. Not all of them are at the French level, but in this respect, French should not be emulated.
Okay, another question, but not previous one.
Another question. What would be the probability of Greece, Cyprus, et al., that they will fulfill their obligations and the rest of the Eurozone countries will not have to pay for their debt? Doesn't matter whether being them excluded from Eurozone or being kept them on a life support system like now. Thanks.
Well, I can't comment on Cyprus now because it's just too fresh. Regarding Greece, well, there is a lot of speculation that sooner or later there need to be a reduction in the debt which is incurred vis-à-vis the other governments. I am not taking a position now, but I can tell you that there is a speculation that given that the debt to the GDP ratio in Greece is 160%, some reduction it's being speculated about. But let me add that sometimes people see, well, economy is so distorted, there are so many barriers to growth, like in Greece until recently. Is it good or bad for the future? It's good, because you have ample room for reforms. So if you do massive reforms, economy may respond. Our countries, Poland, the Baltic, have hugely distorted. Yes, so they were going down, but there was a huge room for reforms. And those countries which did these reforms, called sometimes shock therapy, were rewarded. Because conditions for business, for work, were hugely improved.
Someone? Then Mr. Balcerovič, may I ask also myself, Juris Kravals, Bank of Latvia. It's a question a bit beyond this topic, which is a bit wider. But what we observe in advanced countries, the debt levels are really high ones. For many important countries, close to 100% of GDP. We know from the history that it will take quite a long time to solve this problem. History tells also those instruments, which some are really sometimes frightening, how those problems can be solved. There are milder ones and harsher ones. But what kind of solution do you predict that will be taken for the future to solve this, even beyond the European Union?
First of all, there is a differentiation regarding the debt to GDP ratio. There's not just that every country has exceeded 90 or 100%. It's true that many countries have increased the ratio, but you can contrast, as I try to do, say, you have a contrast here. Just a second. Gross public debt. You have three countries like Japan, Britain and United States, and you have Canada and Sweden. And there are cases when it was possible to reduce the public debt without debt reduction from a high level to a low level through a persistent reforms. Take, for example, Italy and Belgium. Have you heard about Belgium as a problem country recently? Not much. But 10 years ago, Belgium and Italy had the same and very high public debt to GDP ratio, 120 or 30%. And then Belgium have persistently lowered this ratio to, let's say, 90%, which is still high, but much better than in Italy. And they did it. So my obvious conclusion would be that except for some cases when that ratio is very high, which would need debt reduction, in most other cases, there is an economic program which, if implemented, would solve the problem. The most, I would say, almost most serious economic problems have economic solutions. So we are not in intellectual vacuum. But whether the proper solutions are implemented or not depends ultimately on domestic politics. So you have to work at this level to make a proper solution more likely to be accepted. And this is a never-ending battle in democracy.
So, thank you very much.
So with this optimistic note and mobilizing, yes, I understand we complete, yes?
At least no revolutions, but still solutions. Thank you very much for coming, and it's been a pleasure. Thanks, and with this we complete this part of the lecture. Once again, I remind this will be has been recorded and it will be also on the Latvian University website available, including the presentation. Thank you very much.